Yo, welcome back to the Interstellar audio podcast. I hope you're blessed. It's me, Sella. This time around, I'm joined by Telomic. We're about to get into the nitty gritty of his journey through the drum and bass world. We'll cover his production histories, previous aliases, and a whole bunch more. So as always, get comfortable, fill up your brew, sit tight. You're locked into the Interstellar audio podcast. So, Elliot, cheers for joining me, man. I hope you're blessed. First, before we get into anything else, I'm sure everybody here knows who you are, but just in case there are people that don't know who you are, please tell me a little bit about who is Telomic and who you are.
So, yeah, my real name's Elliot. My artist name is Telomic. I've been making drum and bass. I've been really making drum and bass for about 14, 15 years, but as part of the, releasing it and taking it seriously, it's been 6 or 7 years now. Prior to that, I was making kind of EDM-y stuff under my own name from probably 2011, 2012, and that kind of petered out. They reached a point where Telomic came up and that came down, so there was a weird kind of crossover period. But yeah, and I sort of exist majoritatively with Liquidity now, but I'm kind of working with a bunch of other labels as well. So yeah, that's me.
Cool. Well, cheers and welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here, mate. You've already touched on something that I wanted to kind of to cover, which is around how you get started in the EDM world, and then how the genesis of Telomic comes about. How do you move across into Telomic, and what did that transition look like? Because as far as I understood it, your EDM music was performing pretty well. So there has to be some kind of difficult decision at some point that you had to make around saying, okay, there's a pivot point here where I'm going to decide to put more effort into the Telomic side of things. And from the outside looking in, that seems like that might not be the easiest decision to make.
Yeah, so when I first started, the first music I was ever making, before I suppose I was putting it on SoundCloud and trying to do something with it, but it would get 20 plays or whatever, and that was that. It was all drum and bass. It was, growing up, as you know, living in the UK, you're always surrounded by it and you're always growing up with it. My parents were listening to Sub Focus and stuff around the house, and so I was growing up with that as well. But then as I was getting into about 2010, that was the same time as that big dubstep boom, and so I started making stuff like that, and that got a lot of momentum quite quickly, and so I just sort of rode that. Even though drum and bass was kind of where my love was, I was getting more streams, and as a 19-year-old kid, you're like, this is sick, right? I'll put something out, I'll get 1 million plays, and you're like, awesome. So I rode that, and then I got an email, just a cold call email one day in my Telomic. I'd started doing Telomic as an outlet just because I wanted to, and it was around the time that Liquidity had started doing events. And so got this email and we met up for a coffee. He was like, I want to manage you. And I was like, okay, fine. We met up for a coffee, and I remember chatting to him, Will, his name was, and just saying look, this is a side project. I have something that does very well. At that point, I was getting enough from streaming that it was paying my rent, which is a pretty substantial thing to be able to say. And everyone bashes Spotify, and so that there was a lot of streams. And so I was like, I'm not giving that up. I can't afford to give that up, basically. But if you want to do something with it, I'm making no money from Telomic. And so if you want to do it and take 20% or 15, whatever it was, we agreed at the time, 20% of nothing is nothing, so fine. And he first of all started sorting bookings out, and that started getting momentum, which was cool because that was part of the reason that I'd started a project specifically for drum and bass, because I wanted to DJ. My other project was doing well through streaming, but didn't have a good kind of core fan base. And also because I was so all over the place with what I was doing big poppy future bass and then deep, chill garage stuff and all this. I wasn't getting booked for shows because everyone was like, what the hell would he play? The answer was drum and bass. If I was getting booked for shows, I was playing a drum and bass set, which again made no sense because I wasn't making drum and bass. So it was all so disconnected, right? But yeah, and then I'd sent stuff to Liquidity. I'd got booked for a show in a basement in Bristol to 50 people, I think, and bumped into Eli Monroe and Joe Aperio. And both of them were send stuff to Liquidity. Here's the email, and gave me Baldevine's email, or maybe his Facebook or whatever, but gave me a contact for him. And yeah, we just sent some stuff in. My manager at the time was like, just do it, because I never had the confidence to do anything like that. and they picked my music up, and from there it started getting a lot of momentum, and I started playing bigger shows. Like instead of basements to 50 people, we were playing like Electric Brixton and stuff, and it was suddenly like, okay, I kind of want to do this now. And the EDM stuff I'd like fallen out of love with probably like 5 or 6 years before I stopped doing it. But I was doing it in the same way, I guess, that like you could be a songwriter for someone else and you could be like, I hate this, but people resonate with it and it does well, so I'll keep doing it. That's kind of where I was at. I was very detached from what I was making, bar a few tunes. And the stuff I was making that I liked, no one else was really resonating with. So, and it was a transition that happened basically because it became viable. I'd fallen out of love with what I was doing. I was struggling like kind of mentally with the idea of keeping doing that, because you're like, why don't I just get a normal job, right? And then Liquidity came along and it was like, okay, not only can I make this music that I enjoy and get paid, not as much as I was getting paid before, but like enough. And also play these shows and get to travel around and like all of that. It sort of became an option where I was like, fine, this makes sense to do now, so I'll allow myself to do it. Like if you're like 21, it sort of doesn't matter, but the older you get, the harder decisions like that become to make, because you have like more financial responsibility, I guess, which is the position I was in. But yeah.
So you talk there about how at one point it was paying your rent, and obviously that's a great position to be in, like hats off. And so when you went to kind of turning your back on that sound, not that that's fair, but you know what I mean, did you have to make a decision that like, oh, I'm going to have to go and get like a normal job, a day job, or did you, it sounds like you almost kept that mentality of doing that music because it was giving you financial input. So did you have a thought process of like supplementing your income through more music industry work, or did you go straight into like a normal day job life? You're somebody that manages to make what I see as a full-time living out of a collection of music industry work. And so, did you straight away go into that, or did you take a bit of a journey to get there?
No, so I went to university for music production, which, for the record, I don't know if this is a controversial take or not, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. If I was to like redo my sort of early adult life now, I wouldn't have gone to university. Partly just because being self-employed, you have to pay like your student loan in lumps, and I pay like thousands of pounds, and I'm like, rather not have done that. But anyway, yeah, so I was at university and had got a job at Tesco, doing like their picking online orders and stuff, and I hated it. It was like an early morning job. I didn't really like connect with anyone that I was working with, and to be honest, you were kind of isolated anyway. You're just wandering around the shop on your own, picking these things, and you've got to do it quick because otherwise they're on your back and whatever else. And I had this like weird kind of mental dilemma where I was like, I graduated university, I did well, I had this music career that was like bubbling and starting to do well. We'd just signed something with Monster Cat, and I had like a good kind of stream base already. And I was like, I'm working this job for minimum wage that I don't like at 6 a.m, which at the time I was not a morning person. I've only become a morning person now because I'm a dad. If my choice were elsewhere, I would not be. And so I quit, as in I had a week's notice. I probably told this story somewhere else before, but I had a week's notice and I booked a week's holiday and then handed my notice in and was like, I'm gone. This is it. Bye. Didn't really know what I was going to do. And someone else I knew was like, she did vocal samples and was like, why don't you do sample packs? I was like, okay, cool. Like I can do sound design. I'll just do that anyway. And got in contact with a guy who ran like a subsidiary label with Loopmasters and started working for him. But I wasn't basically doing enough that it was like paying enough. It was a small label, and so the rates were quite low. And then kind of shifted over to Black Octopus Sound, which is where I'm at now. So that was kind of going on at the same time. So like the streams were like paying my rent, but like general living was being paid by this sound design work. So that was going on in the background. I made sure that when I had my like meeting with the management about Telomic stuff, that like the contract stipulated specifically that all my work under my own name and everything else, if I ever did sample pack stuff as Telomic, all of that was like separate to the music output, because I was like, to start with, like paycheck to paycheck, and so I was like, I cannot afford to lose 20% of that. But yeah, so it was kind of brewing in the background anyway. Yeah, all spawned again. Like, the reason I got into the music industry outside was because I hated working at Tesco. So it was a leap that I stumbled into. And I've said that about a lot of stuff, even with the Telomic stuff, when people are like, oh, how did you build, like, it's not a full-time career, but how did you build what you've got? And I was just like, I stumbled into it by like hard work and just like taking opportunities as they came up, and like hunting actively for stuff and being like, I'll do that, now I'll do that, now I'll do that, and just seeing where it ends up. So I remember having I had a lunch with, I did for a while and it never kind of amounted to much, but me and Luke and Sampo from UKF started doing a like chill channel. Essentially they were too busy for it to amount to anything, but we had gone for lunch to start kind of talking about that as we'd started it, and Luke had asked about my 5-year plan, and I've never planned that far ahead ever. Quite young, maybe like mid-20s maybe, and he'd asked for a 5-year plan, and I was just like, I don't ever plan that far ahead. Everything I've ever done I've stumbled into. And he was obviously like, he's very business orientated, that's his world, and was like super surprised that was my answer. And in hindsight, looking back, I should have just faked a 5-year plan and like looked more professional. That's probably what my answer would be now, is at least like try and manifest something that I can answer with. But yeah, it was just like, I don't know, you just take opportunities as they come up, write music that I'm feeling, and always like follow that. Because if you set out and you're like, I realize this is way off topic, but if I set out and was like, I'm going to do an album here and an EP here, and then we'll do this vinyl, and I'm going to do a remix for this person and a collab with this person, because it's creative and sometimes these things don't work out, and you feel more inclined to start working on certain projects or whatever, I think I would just beat myself up for not achieving one of those points, even if I'd achieved in place of that something, more substantial. I'd be like, oh, we never did that, that's annoying. If I'd been like, in 5 years I want to play X club, and then that club closes down, like, that's not my fault that I couldn't achieve that, but I'll still feel like a failure for having not achieved it. So everything is just stumbling around.
You still feel like you work through that way now? You're not looking at sort of long-term goals, you're kind of just trying to make decisions in the moment?
I have like when I did the album, I like shifted my perspective when the album came out and was like, I want to focus on singles for a while. And now that is done, I'm kind of reevaluating that to look at potentially doing more long-form projects, not an album, but like maybe putting an EP together and things like that, because it gives you more like room to, you're not just thinking A side, B side, you can put some weird stuff on EPs and whatever. But beyond that kind of general scope, I'm not very specific orientated, for better or for worse, I guess.
I stick to one and a half dozen the other. I think some people need long-term goals to be able to start what they're doing today, and other people, like you explained, a long-term goal is just an opportunity for failure. So I think both are.
Yeah, I think like the example that springs to my mind is when I was at university. This must have been 2013, I think. I was right from early days, like, we're talking like when people used to send demos through AIM and stuff like that. I don't know if you remember that era particularly, but Hospital Records and Liquidity both used to take demos through AIM, and I used to send them through that. And or maybe I sent demos to Liquidity through Skype. I don't know, all sorts of weird places, but it was the Wild West back then. But Maris said no to like all of them, all the Liquidity ones. Hospital never replied, but they would have been established for like 10 years by this point, so Liquidity were fairly fresh, and they said no to everything. And I remember I think it must have been that year, 2013, I was like, by the end of the year I'm going to sign something to Liquidity, and it didn't happen. And And I remember like feeling like a failure and feeling resentful to them because they had stopped me achieving this goal and all of this. And now, 10 years later, I'm obviously a part of that family in a fairly like strong way. And so sometimes these things just take a bit longer, and that's fine. And so I think by putting like restrictive goals onto myself, like, because if you give yourself an open-ended goal, then there's nothing really to strive for because you're just going forever, right? So it's normally like in 5 years, in 6 months, in 1 year, whatever. Yeah, as I said, like sometimes these things just take a bit longer to achieve. I think we're so struck on like overnight success, which is never overnight success, but this idea of overnight success. And certainly my experience is that it's just about the long game, right? And so I don't know where I'm going to be in 5 years' time, but I'm also not going to punish myself if something takes me 6 years instead of 5 years, or 10 years instead of 5 years, whatever. Like, it's just, as long as I'm happy and I'm enjoying myself and I'm still like proactive in what I'm doing, in my mind, that's fine.
Makes sense, because you talk about how you have to put yourself out there to be in the place to take an opportunity when it comes, and you make your own luck in that respect. I think it's interesting to hear you say that you suffered quite a lot of kickbacks from Liquidity to begin with, because when you look from like my perspective, who obviously wasn't that closely following you at that time, it looks like you almost go from the Telomic project, at least, almost goes from nothing to an exclusively signed main feature artist, just like that. But it seems like maybe there was a longer journey there. Was there a turning point where it went from being knockbacks to being like right inside, or was it a more gradual thing that took up? And what was it that triggered that switch to happen?
So to be fair, when they were saying no, this is pre-Telomic. This was under my own name, and I'm glad they said no, because I don't think that music deserved any real kind of spotlight. It wasn't terrible, it just wasn't that good. But yeah, I think with the Telomic stuff, it was a weird one, because when we did send something to them, like I had these two tunes, I had Home and Horizon. Home was with Laura Brem, and Horizon was with Nortel. Both, brilliant, successful vocalists in their own right that I'd worked with in my previous projects. And so I was friends with both of them, and we'd just like written these tunes, and I'd been sitting on them for probably like a year, 2 years. I think I'd even put them through Liquicity's demo box, and they hadn't replied, so I assumed they weren't interested, and then contacted Bao directly, and he then heard them. And they then took them and got really excited about them. And I played Liquidity London maybe the year after. They came out in the summer, and I played in the November. And Bao pulled me to one side and was like, look, like, we want to work with you properly. Like, this isn't a one-off. Like, we want to do something long-term, seriously with you. I assumed he was drunk. I didn't take it too seriously. And to be honest, it was probably timeline-wise like 2 or 3 years before we signed like an exclusive deal with them. But I was working very closely with them the whole way through that period. And obviously like COVID like ate in some of those years, but it was pretty quick from A to B. But it was a long time to get to A in the first place, if that makes sense. Like, there was a long road to get to the point where I had music that was good enough that they got excited. But once I'd been signed by them, it was then like, let's go. So yeah, and that's kind of what I was talking about before. Like, sometimes these things take time because they need the time to take. I've got, people that I speak to that are like, oh, I've been going at this for 6 months and a year and nothing's happening. Like, I've been at this for like 15 years now, like, you've got to put the work in. There's always that little bit. I remember who it was I spoke to about it. I want to say Marky, maybe. And he said a similar thing, that's like, you kind of had to earn your stripes and like, just go for it and spend the time and like learn the industry and be a part of it for a while before you can have that spotlight and be, that, and have like achieve those things and everything else. Like, it just takes a bit of time.
Do you think that the personal relationships come in there as well? Because it almost sounds as though like that face-to-face meeting is almost a bit of a pivotal moment. Maybe it wasn't your first face-to-face meeting with Bao, but we see so many. The scene's like really spread out at the moment. It's super digital, super across the world. Where I see like good traction and good progress is where there's like a collective of people that are geolocated and able to push. But Liquidity is a little different to that, because obviously, you know, their home base is in the Netherlands, but you're here as an artist. But does that then, when you do bring together, is that a trigger point for stuff to be more concrete, or do you think that that's just the way it appears and I'm bark up the wrong tree?
Yes and no. I think it does help, and there's a lot of, like, as someone who is quite anxious, and you know, when you're like talking to people online, it's like difficult to gauge, and you don't want to be too enthusiastic about something because you don't know how that's going to be reciprocated. Whereas when you see someone in person and you're like pitching someone something, sounds very business-like, but like you're kind of proposing something or whatever, you can see the immediate reaction, and you can be like, oh, they're not interested in that, or they're actually really keen, like, let's kind of push this and see what we can do with it. And so I do think the face-to-face meeting helps. Liquidity is a weird one because obviously they are Dutch, and so like it's not like I can pop in the car and drive down to like see them. But because their shows are everywhere, I kind of see them like semi-regularly anyway. And we'll like video call and stuff anyway if there's something important that needs to be spoken about, be it a release or whatever else. We can just hop on a call and do that, and that's, you know, easily done. But yeah, I do think it helps. I mean, you know, that's how like we've met, is at the Bristol Mix sessions. And so again, like, you meet someone and you talk a little bit, and then you then move that online kind of afterwards. And it is an easier way in my mind. I'm like, oh, that's so and so, like we met here or whatever, and it's a bit easier.
I think in my experience, it definitely solidifies the connection. Like you can have an instinct that people have like a collective platform that they could get on with, but when you meet somebody in person, whether it's the first time you've met them or, you know, after you've known them online for a long time, you do get that sort of solidification of that relationship, and then from there it's much easier to build things, I think. So something else that you talked about a minute ago, you were suggesting that you'd gone through a bit of a journey from working on sound design for the Sample Pact, and then turn that into a bit of a bigger gig with Black Octopus. And I know you do a few bits of work around, but it's something that I think in more aspiring producers or people that want to work in the music industry, they maybe have a mentality that says, I've got to get my music performing well enough that it can sustain my lifestyle. But I think you're an example of somebody that's maybe got a broader outlook at that, in the sense that you do a variety of things that sustain your lifestyle, one of which is produce music that performs pretty well. So did that happen by design or by fluke? Did you know that was what needed to happen from personal experience, or is that just, again, taking opportunities as they come up and then keeping hold of the ones that are valuable?
Yeah, I think you know, obviously earlier I said that I wouldn't go to university, and I stick by that, but we had a couple of ironically optional lectures that were quite helpful. One was about taxes and paying taxes and what you can like claim as expenses and all of that kind of stuff as a self-employed artist. And the other was just about building your career as a musician, because I studied music technology, but we were often lumped in with the musicians as well for some of these lectures, and this optional one was about that, and aimed at, like, you know, people who wanted to be a session musician and stuff like that. Like, a lot of people studying these kind of things aren't going to be the focal artist. They might be a session musician, they might be a songwriter, they might be a producer for like other people's music and that kind of thing. And a lot of that was centered around the fact that a lot of people who make a living in this industry do a lot of different things. If you're writing music for adverts, for example, you might get a bunch of briefs through the door that you then have to do and turn around in like 24 hours that then don't get picked. And okay, well then I've got a piece of music that I've written that isn't going to get used. So what can I do with that music? Okay, I can put it into sync libraries. I can pitch it to various other things, like whatever, and making the most out of what you've got and putting everything in different avenues, like putting all your eggs in different baskets. And that way as well, if one thing falls through or stops, like one revenue stream stops, you've always got other things going on. COVID was a big one for that. You know, people are like, oh, well, I need gigs and I need all of that. Fine, but like, what if all your gigs stop? You know, like, what if everything shuts down and you can't do gigs anymore? And so having all of that like security helps a lot. There's also the thing of like, I can't risk that now. Like being a parent, I can't put all my eggs in one basket, because ultimately, if that stops, like my wife only works, part time, and so she wouldn't be able to sustain us on her own salary, and like I've got a kid, and so there are those things to think about as well. And so yeah, it's all kind of just generally about financial security and how you deal with that. That kind of gets into like businessy stuff, I guess, but yeah, it was that lecture that helped, and kind of cemented that in my mind before I'd ever reached a point where I was thinking about this properly as a career, other than like that would be cool. So then going into it, it was like, okay, I know that if I'm doing this, I should probably also do this and this and this and this. And it stops burnout as well. We have sound designers that like do work for us at Black Octopus that churn out so much stuff. And I'm like, if I did that, I'd do it for a month and never ever do it again. So
to keep it varied. Do you find that having that balance between a mentality around creativity and the financial side of it, the business side of it, let's say, is equally important? Like if you were to talk to somebody who's coming up now and starting out now, would you say that having half of their eye on that financial side of things is important, or do you think that just grinding the music and letting the music speak for itself is viable? Because for me, at least, I actually think I would probably encourage people to not get blinded by just the creative side and to make sure that they're thinking about the financial side, because that will be the difference for them between some fun and some success. So I just wondered what your take on that was.
Yeah, absolutely. Music's probably like 30% in reality. You see a lot of people being like, oh, well, so-and-so is like not very good. And it's like, well, they're making probably 10 times what you're making because they're clever about how they do it. And equally, there are people who make absolutely incredible music, like you and I could go on and name people for ages, that don't have the business acumen to do anything with it. And so it doesn't matter. There are exceptions to that. There are people who are exceptionally talented that then get lucky and don't have the business mind, but their music gets heard by the right person at the right time. But pretty much anyone who's, particularly those who've had like longevity in their careers, probably more focused on the business side than the music side, or have a team of people around them that can like kind of fill in those gaps. So they focus on the music, but they've built up a team that allows them to do that. And at some point in their career, they had to be the one focused on everything, So,
well, yeah, I mean that's key. I had trying to find out where the line is about what to say. I had a session with some peers recently this week, and I was blown away by the marketing acumen of a couple of people on that call. Particularly in comparison to myself, obviously I have no marketing specialism at all, but the mindset of some of the people that I was talking to was enlightening and kind of quite inspiring in that respect as well. But it shows the importance of that. The product on its own, without a vision that goes along with it, is almost, there's a ceiling to how successful it could be. It needs that marketable vision to actually take it to something that can be successful. And you said it about there's a kind of three sides to it. There's the art, there's the network, and then there's the business side of it as well. It kind of sounds as though there's those three elements that need to be mixed up in the recipe to make success for somebody coming through. Do you think there's any more crucial ingredients that people developing their act should think about, or is that a triangle that works?
No, I think that works. I think the thing that I tell people to be most mindful of is that, two things I guess that kind of tie into one. And one is that if you're trying to write what is popular and current at the moment, you're too late. Like, find your own lane, stick to your lane. And I don't mean that as don't do anything outside, but like, do what you're good at and what you're passionate about. If you're making big squelchy Belgian jump up tunes, that's been done. And by the time you've done it and finished it and put it out to a label and stuff, you're already kind of on the tail end of that trajectory anyway. Unless you're turning stuff around extremely quickly, and then it probably feels a little sloppy. And that then ties into like sending music to labels. Don't send music to labels that they've already got. Liquidity, one of the guys from there spoke to me about it once and was like, we just get sent loads of music that sounds like Andromatic. And they were like, why would we take this? Because we've got him. So we're not going to take the imitation version because there's no point, because we've already got his music. So, and I think people, particularly new people in the industry forget about that. They're always like, oh, well, if I'm sending something to use Liquidity again as an example, it's got to be big dancehall banger tunes, which might be the case, but be creative with it. Find your own avenue. There are so many different avenues within every subgenre of drum and bass. Don't do the really obvious avenue of that you've heard Liquidity put out 1,000 times, because they've got it and they've done it, and it will never have that level of success because it's going to sound like an imitation of someone else, basically. I hear it a lot. Yeah,
like I've personally had that same feedback from Demo Straight. You send something in and the A&R will come back and say as much as they like it and they would play it and it's well made, they've got X amount in the release train that sounds just like that, and with people that are in their camp. So sorry, but it's not going to happen, is it? And especially at the bigger names, that the bigger brands, it's always going to be that way, I think. So maybe it's someone like us, we're like trying to push a specific sound. We might have room for something that sounds a bit more formulaic because we're trying to build that sound up. But at the bigger brands, it's definitely harder to push their established artists out of the way for something that sounds similar, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's like a phrase that goes around that's like, do something. If you're doing something and you're creating something, either do it differently or do it better than anyone else. If you're copying someone else's sound, you've got to be better than them. And if you're trying to like copy Camo and Crooked, good luck, right?
Yeah, you're going to be better, man.
Yeah, exactly, right? So try and be different instead. And you can like take bits from different pieces and like put that together to create your own like Frankenstein's monster of your own original sound.
Well, that's music, isn't it? That's how music works.
Yeah,
everyone's got their influences, exactly. And they take bits from influences and come up with what their sound is.
Yeah, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but if you're only listening to like one thing and you're just creating like this weird incestuous version of that thing that's only inspired by itself, you're not going to get any success with that.
Yeah, you're not going to get anything original, yeah. You talk about these kind of lessons for people that are trying to develop their sound, and you're someone that does quite a lot in the space of, let's use the word tutorials. You work with DMB Academy, and I've said to you before, so there's no brown nosing going on here, like the way you present your tutored content is very digestible to people. It's super easy to understand. The workflows are not complicated for the sake of complication. If there is a simple way to do something and get the outcome, you're probably showing us the simplest way to get the outcome. But where I'm going with this is you're somebody who's put a lot of time into that tutorial type content, and a lot of people benefit from that. So is that something that you kind of actively went out to do? Is it another opportunity that came up and you jumped on, or is it something that's like you're personally close to and you want that kind of thing to happen?
Kind of a combination. So Andre, Human Nature, who runs DMB Academy, approached me, I think, for one of their... So they do 174 Day, which is the 17th of April every year. And they just put out a bunch of like free content on their channel. And he'd asked me for that. It was like up to 2 hours, just do whatever you want. And so I did a track from scratch. I got lucky. Track from scratches are always awkward because if you start, it's the same as you're like sitting down for a studio session. You don't know how it's going to end up. And sometimes it's bad, but if you're on your own, that's fine. If you're like recording this and like, yeah, you can re-record it. But if I've spent 2 hours recording it, I'm not going to then pause it and delete it and spend another 2 hours. And I got lucky and it sounded all right by the end. And it did quite well on the channel. And got a bit of kind of momentum. And so he then was like, cool, should we do a course? And I was like, yep, fine. Recorded that and put that out. And then kind of that progressed and everything kind of moved step by step from there. But it was also a case from my mind of like, I suppose two things I kind of want to talk about. One was that when I started out and I started on Reason, and there were a few tutorials there, and then moved over to Ableton. And when I started with Ableton, it was like a ghost town. There wasn't a lot on YouTube. It wasn't particularly accessible. And so in my mind, I'm like, what would I have wanted when I started? What can I do to like fill that space? Because there's a lot of content now, but I kind of view some of this with like, okay, they're telling me to do all these things, but like, it sounds really horrible, but like, who are they? Like, what does their music sound like? Like, is this do I want to take their advice and follow down their route if their music actually sounds really messy and horrible and it's not particularly like interesting for me? And so I still think there's kind of room to like cover topics like that, because I'm like, okay, if people like my music, then this is how I do it. Even if someone's shown how to make a respace before, this is how I make my one in my music, that kind of thing, right? And then the other one, I guess, with the like easily digestible and like fairly simple topics is that they've got a lot of like crazy sound designers on there. And I mean like crazy in the sense that the stuff they do is really good, not that they're like mentally unstable. And so like people like Molecular and guys like that who are, from a sound design point of view, like incredible producers. And I can't match that. If I was like, this is how I make a crazy bass sound, they'll do that in their sleep and it'll sound better. And so I'm like, don't do it. Either do it better than everyone else or do it differently. So I'll do it differently instead. I'll like cover the simpler topics. I'll cover musicality because that's like what my background is. And that kind of angle on stuff. Here's how you make atmospheres and that kind of thing, rather than the super kind of techie side of it.
I think it's important because when I work with people that are just starting out, I kind of suggest them to look for a couple of things. And I took the same advice myself, to find somebody that is giving out tutorials that are a sound you want to make, a sound that you're interested in, not specifically the exact sound you want to make, but a sound that you like, has elements that you would need to make the sound you're trying to make. But then it's also important to find somebody who's transmitting that message in a way that like you relate with. There's nothing worse than watching like a 2-hour tutorial of somebody who's doing something in a way that just you completely wouldn't do it that way. It doesn't make sense to you. Then you're trying to force your creative workflow down this like really alien path. Not that it's bad or wrong, it's just so alien to the way that you would potentially work that it makes it hard for you to gain the right kind of outcome from it. And I think, you know, when you're starting out, it takes that time to find a couple of sources that will give you the information that's going to help you progress in a way that your brain can naturally go, oh, okay, I'm vibing with this. And then if you find a couple of people like that, I just counsel people to sort of stick on that path for a while until you outgrow that bit, and then find some other stuff, or maybe by that point you kind of developed on anyway and you're on your own path. So I think it's important to find those kind of things where people are teaching in a way that you relate to, rather than just, this is the sound I want, and forgetting about how it's being presented to you, because you might actually not pick up what you need from it because you don't work in the same way that person's presenting it, right? So for me, that's something that's important to think about when you're starting out. If you're looking for tutorials, I mean, everything I do is just about tutorials, so I'm in that space. So it's still valuable advice that I take myself. Yeah, but so I was going to ask you, do you think that there are, and this isn't about people, this isn't about individual lessons, this is about in general, do you think there are bad lessons that are given to producers? Do you think there's advice out there that kind of prevails that's actually not necessarily either that positive or that important or that right? Are there any, the answer to this might be no, but are there any like repeating themes that you've come across that you think are just bad advice?
Oh yeah. There are so many examples online of like the blind leading the blind. I think I actually said this on Discord the other day. There was they're like, I think it must be the EDM production subreddit, and this was years ago now, but someone had asked about producing with a limiter on and like having a limiter on the master, on the output. And I'd said like, because I do this occasionally, especially like if you're trying to know what your tune will sound like when it's like squeezed for a club master and stuff. But you always have to be careful, because if you've got one on, it's going to affect how your transients sound because they're getting squashed by the limiter. And so I had said like, basically, especially if you're learning, like don't do it. If you're like comfortable with how that will work and how it will influence your sound and everything, cool, go for it. Like have it on and then just A/B it every so often. But I said, you know, if you're learning, like don't, and got absolutely downvoted to oblivion. And was basically told that I was an idiot and like get stuffed by like, you know, you check the like comment history of like these guys and they're all like 16-year-old producers who are just starting out, and you're like, okay, cool, right. And I never commented on there again. I think I unfollowed the subreddit. I was like, oh, fair enough, this is what it is. But it is like these kind of echo chambers of people who don't really know what they're doing, but are like encouraging each other for the sake of encouraging each other. And I don't necessarily think that the encouragement side is a bad thing, but you've got to be kind of aware of where you're getting your information from. And that, if I'm doing a tutorial, I always say that as well, like in person especially. Like, just because I do it this way, if you disagree with the way I do it, don't do it that way. That's fine. If you're like, oh, actually, I would do this way, then do it that way. Like there's so many ways to get an end result now, and especially like there's so many different plugins and various things that can help, that the end result is, does the music sound good? But just always kind of be aware of like, if you're getting information from, as I said like earlier, like what does their music sound like? That's your easiest answer. Like, does their music sound good? Okay, well, if I like what their music is and they're telling me that they create it this way and that's kind of where I want to be, then fine. But if I'm getting it from like a random comment section, like, if I put a tune out and someone's commenting like, I would have done the snare this way, cool. Fine. That's not particularly helpful to anyone, but I get it. That's cool. You do you. It's always been this way. Like when I was making the EDM stuff, the audience that I was pitching to was more like producer orientated. And so it was worse then, because you were getting all these comments and all these things from like all these different people saying all these different things. And you're like, I can't verify if any of this is actually useful information. It's less so now. But I would also imagine that part of that is just because my like audience that I pitch to and the spaces that I kind of exist in online are different now. And if I was just starting out, I would probably still end up in these like echo chambers that I used to be in before and still come across those kind of issues. So
you mentioned earlier that as you were growing up, your parents would listen to Sub Focus around the house. And that's a cool vision for me, because that's potentially the experience that my kids are having now, because I'm always blasting drum and bass around the house. But when I was growing up, it was a different sound. My parents were into things like Moody Blues and Beautiful South, which gave me a lot of like that kind of funky soul type influence in the sounds that I like. But were you like influenced by a musical household, or did you come into music on your own? Like, your parents musicians or that kind of thing. What was your route into music, and what are your influences into music? Because you've made such a breadth of different styles of sounds.
Yeah, so my parents were both musical but not musicians. So my dad was like, played guitar and like was in a few like cover bands and stuff on and off as I was growing up. And then my mum had played piano as she was growing up but had stopped by the time I was born. So I like existed in a musical space where it was like encouraged, but it wasn't like my parents were, like touring musicians, and I grew up in that kind of world. But because of it, I picked up violin when I was very young. I was, I think, like 5 or 6 when I started learning violin, and so that kind of helped. And then when I hit my early teens, violin wasn't particularly cool, and so I picked up guitar because that's what my dad played. And he had a bunch of like guitars and stuff around the house, and sort of taught myself that. And so I grew up with music, but it wasn't like they were kind of both professional musicians or anything like that. But it also helped, like, my mum used to listen to a lot of like old garage stuff and like Kiss FM and that kind of thing. So I grew up with dance music on her side. And then my dad used to listen to a lot of kind of old metal. Slayer and Iron Maiden and Metallica and that kind of stuff, and then some more kind of indie stuff in the early 2000s when that sound was really big. And so it was like both of those things kind of existing at the same time. And obviously, like the early Sub Focus sort of late 2000s stuff existed right in the middle of both of those sounds. I use Sub Focus as an example, but there was a lot of other kind of, people like Dead Mouse and stuff as well was quite kind of big in our house. Daft Punk were another one. So yeah, it was good to kind of grow up with that. I think a lot of people sort of grow up and the dance music is like a sort of rebellion against what their parents listened to. And I never really had that, to be honest.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting take, because it definitely was that way for me. Like as a teen listening to metal or pop punk or whatever, and then dance music, that was very much you don't get it, mum. Like you don't understand our music. Not that that's a conversation I had with my mum, but whereas it does sound more closely aligned in your experience, which is cool. It's just something that I think would be cool. Do you have visions for what that might look like for you and your son now that you're a dad? Do you think you'll bring him along to events? Like, what do you how much do you think you'll influence his life in terms of music?
It's hard. I mean, he's 2 now, so it's hard to say because it's still early days. One of his favorite tunes at the moment is Backbone, the Chasing Status Stormzy tune. But I think partly because it says "uh-oh" several times, and he can like sing along with it as it goes and builds along. But he, if I get sent stuff during the day and I'm like sat with him in the living room and he's playing, I might just listen on my phone or whatever. And he loves like dancing to music that I'm playing, and often it is like drum and bass stuff or garage or whatever. And he does enjoy it. Mine and my wife's music tastes are quite like polar, and so it'll be interesting to see like where maybe it'll be the same as me, like, and he'll take influence from both. I don't know, like, like 80s, 90s hits and like modern drum and bass. I don't know where the midpoint of both of those sounds is, but maybe he'll create that. I don't know. But yeah, we'll see. As I said, it's early days now, so it's hard to tell.
My experience is quite similar in that split amongst my three are quite different tastes, but considering as they've all three of them have been exposed to like the same two corners of sound, from myself and my wife, but all three of them have picked up on like different elements of it. One of my kids really likes liquid D&B, another one's more into kind of trancey type sounds, and another one's a bit more varied. But my youngest, I can already tell that he's going to be a really good A&R, because he's straight away, if he's not vibing something, he'll tell you he's not vibing it. But if a track comes on that he's loving, and he'll get down and groove to it, which is quite fun.
Got that A&R honesty down early.
Yeah, and that's a hard skill to develop, man. Like I was saying to you in DMs the other day, like it's a very difficult thing to tell somebody that you don't like their art. But I guess the innocence of a 2-year-old, they don't have any reason not to tell you that.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, that's something that I've personally found quite hard to develop, because it's not always that you don't like their art. It can be that their art isn't what you're looking for at the same time. But giving that message, it's about how the other person perceives it, and somebody's put a lot of work into what they're showing you, and for you to just reject it for any reason, it's quite easy for them to receive it as you don't think it's good, which is very rarely the case. But also, you never want to leave that impression with somebody. It's quite a difficult thing to do, to be honest.
Yeah, I find it difficult sometimes as well. If I do the A&R on the sample pack side, and sometimes you're like, this isn't what we're looking for at the moment, and then they'll come back with, what are you looking for? And the answer sometimes is, I don't really know. Just something that feels interesting and exciting and kind of fits within the sound of the scope of sound, that our label would publish. But I can't tell you exactly what that is necessarily, and that can be difficult. And it's also sometimes to try and save face and try and avoid giving like really horrid feedback. You do just say it's not what we're looking for, and then they'll come back and then you have to give that feedback. And that can be difficult as well, to basically tell someone that something they've spent hours and hours and hours on isn't that good and should be kind of used as a learning experience and a stepping stone, rather than something that is a foundation for a career. Yeah, and that can be difficult. And it's difficult to hear. Like sometimes, we both, I'm sure, made tunes that get rejected, and you look back now and you're like, the tune sucked, right? Like, I'm glad they didn't do anything with it. But at the time, you're invested in it and you think it's great. And hearing that it's not, it hurts.
Yeah. So you're somebody that has done a lot of work with lots of different people. So you've done lots of collaborative work with different vocalists and different producers as well. And when you're talking about this piece around back and forthing around whether it's that, the track is right or not, I'm thinking that experience must translate also into collaborative work. You must have occasions where sometimes it's just not working. You might be 3-4 sessions into a thing and it's just not going on. And so not just the negative side of it, but when you're collabing with people, whether it be in the same room or across the internet, like how do you approach that topic? And, what takeaways have you got about how to give that the best chance of a success it could be, or what to do when there's just to wake up and say, this one's not particularly working? Have you got any insight into those kind of things?
I'm usually quite transparent to start with, in the sense that, one, I normally only work with people that I'm kind of close with, because I know that they'll take that feedback without taking it to heart. And I can have, because it is a difficult conversation, And the other is, I usually give it a bit of time, but sometimes I'll try and be quite frank quite early on. But I don't have any particularly good advice other than that, just because sometimes these like difficult conversations don't have like a play-by-play in terms of like how you can deal with them. I've had, to be fair, I say recently, it was probably a while ago now, a collaboration with a guy that I only knew online, but we were aware of each other's music. I won't say the name, but we'd worked on this collab for ages, and I kept saying like, I don't think this is that good, and they kept pushing it. I was like, okay, fine. I kept then kind of trying to give it the benefit of the doubt and kept trying, and it reached a point where I had to just put the foot down and be like, look, I'm sorry, this it's not a bad tune, it's just not that good, and like I wouldn't feel happy putting this out because I don't feel excited by it, and if I'm not excited by this tune, it's just like bland liquid at that point. It's just like some pads, a bass line, some drums, and like it's background music, right? And some people love that, and I think they loved it. I just didn't, and it was difficult, and they got pretty pissy with me, just based off the fact that I wasn't feeling it, and that was difficult. But I'd said multiple times throughout the conversation, like, I'm not feeling this, and it just kept being pushed. Yeah, it's again, as I said, that's why I tend to restrict who I work with, just for that reason. It's easier to say no. Like Lower and I have probably written like 5 tunes now, and not one of them's been good enough to put out, and that's fine. Like Ben and I get on well enough that it reaches the point where you're like, this kind of sucks, doesn't it? And you're both like, yeah, and it gets left there, and that's fine.
But sometimes that's important because you leave the bad tune behind, and then it gives you space to work on the tune you haven't written yet that turns out to be great, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's it. Like, you've got to kind of know. I see advice online that's like, finish every tune you start, which certainly for me is like the worst advice that I could give anyone, because I know within like 16 bars of an idea whether it's worth doing or not. And it's the same with collabs. Usually I can tell within like 2 sessions if it's actually going to work or not. Yeah, it's difficult. I know another thing, I guess, is like just to make sure that neither of you when you're working are precious about what you're doing. Because if it reaches like, you're 5 sessions in and it's not working, and then someone else completely like breaks apart what you've got and essentially remixes it in something else, that you're not sat there like, oh, I liked the chords though, can we use those? Like, fine, maybe the chords were great, but the idea sucked and this idea works, ditch that. And, yeah, just try not to be too precious.
Let the thing evolve, right? I'm trying to see what the flip side of those negative experiences would be. Not negative, maybe that's not fair, but like, are there times when a collab is just like a magic experience where stuff just falls out? Like, you don't even have to put any effort into it. You just fall out an absolute, masterpiece that you're happy with. And therefore, in that scenario, are there any kind of lessons you can take away from a scenario like that about how to maybe maximize that kind of likelihood of that happening? Or is it just pure chance?
I had someone ask me, maybe even yesterday, about my experience, not even just with collaborations, but with like writing good ideas. Because in my mind, I was at the time talking about mix downs and the actual core idea and like musicality, and that I think your mix down should be the last thing on your mind, and that your core idea is the important bit. If you have the best mix down in the world, but the idea sucks, you've wasted your time on the mix down anyway. There's no point because the tune isn't very good. If you've got a really good idea, but you can't quite get your snare hitting at the right level or whatever, fine. Like, the idea is great. People will ignore the slightly too loud snare. It's fine. And I think we forget that, in these like producer bubbles. But for me, getting a good idea and getting that to that like flow state where you said it, the idea just kind of happens, is literally just, it's like the monkeys writing Shakespeare, where I will just keep writing ideas and eventually a good one comes out. And as you said, like, sometimes those bad collab ideas have to go so that the good one can happen. And in my experience, that's why, is you just write a lot of music. And sometimes I go through stages of like months where I just write bad ideas for months and months and months on end. But then I'll have periods of time where like I'll write 5 great ideas in a week, and you're sorted then. So it's just keep writing, basically. And it's also like a practice thing as well. The more you're practicing your writing, the better you get at that. Like, the ideas that I deemed as good and bad 10 years ago, the good ideas then I would deem as bad ideas now. And some of the stuff I say is bad now would have been like the best thing I'd ever written 10 years ago. But now it's not good enough because my like perspective is always shifting. But it's just part of that process.
Do you think there's a way to approach an idea? Like, do you start with an empty head, or have you like had a brainwave in the middle of the night and recorded a voice note, or like, what, how do ideas come about? How do you start with something and turn it into a track? Like, what are you looking for? Are you looking for a melody, or are you looking for, what does that story look like to you?
Usually it's chords, but there can be a few different ways. Sometimes it's like I'll hear a cool idea and I'm like, oh, if I like took this and then did this to it and then did this, like, what could I do with that? But sometimes it's as simple as like having a big atmosphere, like a drone in like F or whatever, right? G sharp, whatever the drone is in, and then writing a bass line that fits with that will then imply chords. So like, if you're in F minor, for example, and I put a C sharp, then let's assume that then chord above that is a C sharp major, and going from there and like, how do I evolve those? And then, okay, I've got my chords, I've got my atmosphere. Let's put some drums in, and like, what kind of vibe is that invoking? I'll sometimes approach with an idea of a vibe or like where I want to go, and then the chords can, or whatever, can evolve into that. But again, I try not to be too precious with it, because sometimes you'll do something by accident and you're like, oh, actually, that sounds cool, let's go down that avenue, rather than being like, oh, okay, I've got this cool piano thing, but I was going to do something dark and minimal, so let's scrap that. Instead, you followed the idea instead of trying to chase it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense, yeah. So like let the inspiration take you rather than be wedded to what was in your head that you're trying to make.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was like Rob Swire, and I may have even had, this may not even be a Rob Swire quote, it may have been misquoted or made up or whatever. I think he was saying that like a bunch of the early Pendulum hits were just them trying to copy other people unsuccessfully.
Ah, right, interesting take, yeah.
And you know, part of it's that is like, I'll hear something that's really cool and no, I can't do it. But like, what happens if I try? Like, where can I go with what I end up with following them?
I mean, that's how my music production works. I'm like, I like this guy's style. Can I try and do something like that? Nah, but this is all right, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And then you're like also doing what I was saying before, like leaning into your strengths, and like, rather than chasing something else, you're like, I'm good at doing X, so let's go down that avenue, and not being too like precious with anything.
Yeah, you learn from trying to understand how a technique comes about. Like, you know, you could say I'm copying someone else's song, but also it's about trying to unpack it, understand how it's constructed, understand how it's made, and then you take away learning from those lessons, and that becomes part of your toolbox then in the future. I think all that's valuable.
Yeah, and like, you know, some of the best like modern dance music producers now, like Virtual Riot used to like remake a load of old Skrillex tunes and learn a lot of like sound design and stuff. And I mean, he was like remaking them near on exactly. He was obviously very, very, very good at what he does, but it was a part of that like learning process, was being like, what are they doing? And I think that's, you know, if you're like copying a tune bit for bit, like if I'm stuck on arrangements, I'll like drag in another tune that I like and like copy the arrangement of that, because hey, it like works with DJing anyway, so it's a DJ friendly like arrangement of a tune, and it's just like, that worked for them, let me try it. And it's the same with like a bunch of different effects and stuff. You hear like, oh, that build up sounds good, they did this with the vocal, I'll do that. So like what we spoke about near the start was like bits and pieces from different people, and you just slot it all together to create this like jigsaw of what your music is.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, as well, you know, we've talked about this a little bit already, and you just mentioned DJing again, but as well as the production side, the DJing side of things for you is massive. Like, you've obviously talked about how you wanted to DJ drum and bass, and that was something that motivated you to make that switch into the Telomic project away from the EDM project. But you've had quite a prolific set of shows that you've done over your years, and I just wondered if you had any insight into, for someone like me, any insight into what it's like to play a giant festival stage like you've done over at Liquid City. Also, what it's like to put together something completely left field in an environment that is not normally going to be in. So you did that time traveler set, didn't you? Which was vibey. And then a bit of commentary on, you know, what you like about DJing at events. Is it certain types of events? Is it certain environments? You know, just any kind of commentary on that type of thing.
For bigger shows and stuff like that, kind of depends on the show. I played some big shows that are like massively disorganized, and you turn up and like no one knows where you're going or what you're doing or whatever, which is always surprising, because you're like, the amount of budget and all these different people and everything else is, you'd have thought that everything would like run to a T. So that kind of throws you off. But most of them, I don't, you know, I wouldn't have said that I'm like a big A-list artist. I'm obviously none of that, but you still get treated like one, which can be nice, getting like taxied around and ferried around and Everything else is awesome. Particularly some of the really big ones. The sound is great because it's quite quiet on stage. And so, like, if I'm playing like a tiny 100 cap venue and, you know, I've got like no real booth monitors and everything, it can be quite difficult to mix because it's so loud and it's right by your head. You can't hear in your headphones very well. Yeah, so having like the bigger stage setups and everything means that it's actually way more comfortable to play. And that's always nice. It's also nice to feel kind of, there's like a community with a lot of these. Like most people in drum and bass are generally really lovely people. And so if you're like traveling around and like playing these shows, you see a lot of the same people. And it is like this kind of family away from home almost, which is like, it's great just to have that community and to feel comfortable. Especially like in a country you've never been to, you don't know anyone, you don't speak the language. There's still like some sort of security there, if that makes sense, which is nice. On the kind of negative side, there's a lot of traveling on your own. Like I don't get paid enough for a show that I can like take an entourage with me. And so, you know, you are like, there's a lot of isolated time, which sometimes is great. I'm someone who likes time on their own. If I've got up at 4 a.m. and I've got to the airport and I'm like, you know, half asleep, I'd kind of rather there was no one around.
Yeah.
But if you're playing for an hour at a show and you don't have much time at the show afterwards to sort of see people and say hi, you can spend like 12 hours and face-to-face speak with like 2 people in a space of like 10 minutes. And so it's kind of a bit weird on that side. In terms of like the left field stuff, the Time Travelomic set was the first time I've ever done that.
How did that come about?
I was originally really weird. I was originally going to do a garage set, like a throwback garage set, which I'd pitched like ages ago. And then my mum had asked me to DJ at her wedding this summer just gone. And I put together a bunch of like, because she hadn't given me any specification. I was like, if I play drum and bass at your wedding, like you'll go home, let alone everywhere else, you will go. I was like, okay, like what can I play? I was like, as I said, like we grew up with a lot of the dance classics and stuff. I was like, I'll play that. And her now husband was into that as well, so perfect. And I really enjoyed putting it together. So when Alex from Niquity came to me and was like, hey, like we're putting together the like secret stage sets, I heard you wanted to do a throwback garage. I was like, can we switch it and just do full throwback dance? And I was like, cool. He said cool, and then was like, what do you want to call it? And the original name was Telomic's Time Traveling Tea Party, and the name was too long for the flyer, so you can't have that. So we came up with Time Travelomic as like a shortened version of it.
Both are great.
Yeah, I prefer the first one, but I do understand it's too long.
Would you have lent into it with the Tea Party vibes? Would you have come in a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Like had a cup of tea while I was a whole lot. Because I did this one in with some like goggles and a lab coat on for the kind of Back to the Future vibe. But yeah, that was probably as a DJ the most fun I've like ever had. Was doing that. Yeah, it was just the stupidest, funniest thing ever. And like I was playing it thinking that everyone would leave. They played like Nero before I came on. It was like a 2-hour Nero like. And so I was like, they're going to absolutely hate this. And you know, a lot of people left. I was playing at the same time as like headliners had started as well. It was like really late on the last day. So this is like clashing with like Andromedic, I think the start of Sub Focus, like this kind of. So that was difficult. And it was just like a decent sized crowd and a bunch of my mates on stage. I didn't realize they were coming on. They just all turned up with like inflatables and all this kind of thing. It was just like, yeah, it was great. So the plan is that we'll do that next year as well, but I've not spoken to Niquity about that. So, and then there was a third question as well. What was the third one?
It was like, I think you've already kind of covered it, because it was talking about the differences and your preferences between different types of events, and you sort of talked about your on-stage experience and then also the traveling experience as well.
I think in terms of that, it's sort of, if I play a big show where I know nobody and like no one really gels with it, and especially if you're on a lineup that makes no sense for you to kind of be on, it feels a bit like soulless. I played an event not too long ago where I was trying to pitch the crowd, and I couldn't pitch the crowd. And so, like, I was playing something and they weren't really feeling it. And then I'd finally find something I think they were feeling. And you go down that avenue and then you look up and, like, half the room's left. And then you're like, okay, well, clearly that's not what they're after either. And you spend the whole set trying. And you come off and everyone's like, oh, that was sick. And you're like, was it really? In terms of, like, size of event, I don't necessarily have a preference because that's happened at, like, bigger and smaller events. You feel like some of them go really well and some of them don't. And the ones that are the best are just the ones where, like, you really feel like everything connects. Like the crowd, like, are really into it. And you have, like, those moments, like if you play a song of yours and you look up and they're, like, singing it back to you and you're like, okay, this is a good crowd. Like, these are my people, right? And they, like, allow you to go down those avenues. Like, I started, like, before a lot of this, when I first got into DJing, I'd started producing and that had started picking up traction. So I was like, I need to learn to DJ. So I was playing, like, parties and weddings and stuff with friends of mine. Which I believe you did as well. And, like, that is, you're like, you have to play such specific things. And you play something that people don't like and the crowd turns on you, like, instantly. And you're just like, I've been doing well up to this point. If you don't like this is like, it could be something that is so adjacent to what you were already playing that they loved, but they just don't like that specific tune. And there's no way you could have known that. But it happens, right? Whereas as an artist now, if I go down a tangent and play new music and stuff they've never heard before, there's, like, an excitement from people. Like, I love going out and hearing tunes I've never heard before. There's that moment where you will turn to your mates and stuff and you're like, what the hell is this, right? But, like, in a good way and excited. I love creating those moments. Like, playing tunes that I've been sent or that I've created or whatever, and seeing a crowd reaction of people being like, oh my God, this is awesome. And you could never get that, obviously, you know, doing weddings. So yeah, it's those are the kind of the best bits, I guess.
The thing about weddings as well is it's such a fragile dance floor because, like, yeah, maybe there's 200 people there, but you're only, you know, you think about who goes to wedding, you're only ever really going to get like 20 or 30 people at most on the dance floor. If you play something that doesn't resonate with those people and you're down to like 3 people in front of you, it's just hard to then regain momentum from it.
Yeah, definitely.
There are 8 hours of that every Friday and Saturday night. You're like, this is quite deep.
Yeah, I used to play like a real kind of dive bar club in the town I went to school in. I think it's closed now. Some nights you'd just be playing to like no one. Or you'd be playing to like the kind of people you don't really want to be playing to. I had one night and I played a New Year's Eve there. And I played like, this was again like probably 2010. And like I played some sort of dubstep stuff in this set. And we were playing like, there were like 4 of us and we were playing an hour and just rotating on and off. So we had a couple of sets. And this was my first set. And, you know, we're in like 3 hours into the night at this point. And the owner came over and was like, we don't play that in here. I was like, the dance floor is busier than it's been all night. The dance floor's next to the bar. So it's not like, you know, if people are on the dance floor, they're also buying drinks and stuff, right? Yeah, and I had to play a bunch of house music stuff. Fine, no disrespect to house, but like everyone then started leaving. And I turned to my mate who booked me for it and was like, and I was like, I'm done. Like, I'm not waiting another 4 hours to do that again. So I was like, see you later, and went home. Yeah, not great.
It is hard because your job as a DJ is to fill the dance floor, rotate the floors of people buy drinks. And when you're doing that successfully and the person who's paying your invoice is telling you you're doing a bad job, that's hard.
Yeah, you know. They had to rebrand the place like 3 times and then eventually closed. So there's sort of like a karma, I guess, to that, in the sense that like he's, you know, telling people how to do their job when he clearly doesn't know how to do their job, and it's now backfired, and his own ego is like, you know, got to him, I guess.
So looking ahead then, and noting that you have communicated that you're not somebody who necessarily sets goals, and I had written in my notes 2025 and beyond goals, but what does direction look like for the project of Telomic or you as an individual? You know, are there valuations you've made this year or last year that you're sort of working into your direction for next year and beyond, or certain things you'd like to go out and make happen? Are there any of those sort of things you've got going on that you're trying to make do with?
I think more stylistically than anything else. So as I mentioned before, like I'm kind of leaning into the idea of putting more long form projects together. But I also spent a long time, I think as I started getting later sets and like bigger sets and stuff, this idea started coming to me in being like, okay, well, if I'm playing these bigger shows, then I need to make bigger sounding music and like more energetic stuff and all of this, and got in my head a lot about that. And so I spent a long time trying to write stuff unsuccessfully that fit a vibe that wasn't really what I was about. And so I've kind of started coming out the other side of that now. I had to do a guest mix and for a Man from Del Monte. That was just all Deep Liquid. I just did a Deep Liquid guest mix. I was like, actually, this is what I love. Like, this is what I'm about. This is what I've kind of grown into this genre with, and is what I'm like passionate about in this music. And so I'm now with the mindset that like, okay, let's write what I'm good at and what I enjoy, which is just deep, introspective, liquid stuff. And occasionally the old like darker minimal thing, if that is where my head goes, but at less like banger orientated tunes, I guess. And so going into 2025, that's where I'm going, is like all about that side of stuff.
You got any secret projects that you want to talk about? Like, have you got any mad bookings that might not? I don't mean anything. I don't mean I'm not trying to plug our booking. I mean, have you got some crazy stuff in the work for next year that, without announcing, you might tease a little bit?
I don't know what I'm allowed to say. That's the difficulty, isn't it? The end of the year ends strong. Just before Christmas, we've got Zurich, and then the week after that is Liquidity Winter Festival, and I've got a big unannounced back-to-back for that, which will be awesome. It's with someone that I've looked up to and been close to for a while, so it'll be a lot of fun, like from that perspective, but it'll also be our first sort of set together like that, which will be good. So yeah, as for 2025, as I said, I don't know what I'm allowed to say at the moment, so it's not as exciting an answer as it should be, I'm afraid. But
so, from my point of view, I've got a nice email from your agent for contract to sign for booking you for our May event, which I'm excited about, and I'm grateful that you'd come along with that. So, if anyone did make it to the end of the podcast, they may as well know that in May the 10th in Nottingham, you'll be coming to join us on a to-be-announced event, and that's going to be a wicked honour for us. So I'm looking forward to that, mate. Thank you for getting involved in that and being a diamond about the way you've approached it as well. It's definitely not going unnoticed, so thank you for that.
No, man, I'm really looking forward to it. Be good.
Me too. And yeah, I think beyond that, I haven't really got anything else to grill you about. It's been a super interesting conversation from my point of view. I learned a lot about your process, and yeah, you're as transparent and humble and honest as it seems like you would be, so I appreciate that you'd be that way with us on the phone, mate. Thank you very much.
No, yeah, thank you for having me, man. It's been a pleasure. Good little chat.
Good chat. My kids literally just pulled up on the driveway. I don't know if you heard all the car slamming.
I didn't, but that's perfect timing, isn't it?
Yeah, I didn't think they were coming home, but they've come home. That probably means something's wrong, so I'm going to go and have to figure out what's going on.
Into awesome.
Elliot, mate, thank you so much. So I appreciate that you come on board with me, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It's been a pleasure.